This is a summary of sermon number 6 by Joseph Butler, and it's entitled Upon Compassion, which is the same as sermon number 5. It's the same topic, and it even comes with the same Bible verse, which is Romans chapter 12, verse 15, which says, "Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep." He begins this sermon in the first paragraph by restating his teleological method of investigation, which means that he is inferring moral principles from a close examination of human nature. And what he's discovered through this examination is that human beings are capable of doing both good and evil to one another, but they're more capable of doing evil than they are of doing good to one another. And thus, they are more capable of preventing that evil and also relieving the suffering in the world. And so he thinks that God has given us this feeling of compassion to aid us in this endeavor. He thinks that the social nature of human beings does three things, and that is prevent evil, it relieves suffering, and it also does good to others. He's concerned with the first two because that's what compassion is related to. He states in paragraph number 3, which is only one sentence long, that, quote, "the final causes then of compassion are to prevent and to relieve misery." He only gives one example of compassion preventing evil, and that is like the example of revenge. So if somebody wrongs me and I have the opportunity to take revenge on that person, he thinks that the feeling of compassion will prevent that revenge from occurring, and he thinks that's a good thing. With regards to the second part of the purpose of compassion, which is to relieve misery, he thinks that he first considers that nature itself is not just all full of misery. He thinks that it's also full of relief, and he thinks God has designed it that way. That's paragraph number 5. He also thinks that even though we tend to want to avoid suffering in life, this feeling of compassion leads us to address it, to face it, and to relieve it wherever we find it. He uses the example of food again, just like he has in previous sermons, the appetite for food. And so, just as he said before, it would be unnatural for us to deal with our appetite for food by avoiding food altogether. It would also be unnatural for us to deal with our compassion by avoiding misery in the world. And so he thinks we should address it, and that's a sign that we have this passion or this emotion. So at this point in the sermon, he moves on in paragraph number 7, he moves on to a slightly different angle or approach to the topic of compassion. So far he's considered how it's part of our nature to be compassionate, and then now he's going to consider the great goods that come out, the great benefits that come out of being compassionate. And his example is of helping the poor. So he compares helping the poor to helping the rich, people who are not suffering. And he considers that helping the poor actually brings a lot more good in the world, and so then we should follow our hearts, our feelings of compassion toward the poor by helping them and bringing that good into the world. He considers the question whether it's possible to feel too much compassion or to be too compassionate. He says certainly that's a possibility, but he thinks in our world it's more likely that people don't give it enough attention and ignore it. And so that's another reason to emphasize it, stress it, and to preach about it as he's doing here. So moving on to paragraph 11, he considers another idea that leads to this notion of the importance of compassion. He says that compassion teaches us about the proper way of living. He thinks that by having this feeling of compassion, it will lead us to, quote, moderation, humility, and soberness of mind. He thinks that we don't even necessarily need to suffer ourselves some sort of tragedy just by having the feeling of compassion and seeing others suffer. That this will be instruction for us to live our life as we ought to. And he says that compassion can also aid us in our remembrance of our human nature. He says we suffer from forgetfulness, and that grieving or coming alongside somebody who is suffering will help us remember that what the purpose of our existence is, and that it's not meant to be just living a life of self-indulgence. So he wraps up the sermon saying that compassion has two reminders. First, it's that it will remind us how we ought to live our lives. And finally, it will remind us that this world is not our home and that there's a better world that does not have suffering in it awaiting us in the next life. So I hope that helps with your understanding.